One of the central themes of your book, Plato at the Googleplex, is the tension between philosophy and science. How do you see these two fields interacting, and what do you think philosophy can offer that science cannot?
Yeah, this is a question I think maybe my whole career has been directed toward answering this question because I began university and actually went through university as a math and physics major and never intending to be a philosopher or to study philosophy. And it was my last year and already planning to go on to graduate school in physics that I was taking an advanced course in quantum mechanics. And I had a professor, and I kept asking him, what is this theory telling us about the world, about what lies beyond our observations and, the nature of reality, which is a word many physicists were allergic to. And finally, my professor said, why don't you go talk to the philosophers? They're interested in this kind of meaningless question. It was the attitude based on what the great physicist Richard Feynman had said, which is shut up and calculate. Just do the math, grind out the predictions, and don't ask, what does it all mean? And this just, for me, undermined my whole motive and inspiration, I think, ever since I was a child, of wanting to study physics and understand, what the world is so very different than the way it appears to us. What is it really like? Well, I was told by this physicist that's not the kind of question you ask in physics. Just getting your observations, use the theory to grind out your predictions, and all of these questions of, what does it really mean and what is reality really like are verboten. And so then I went and spoke to a very prominent philosopher of science. Mind you, this is my senior year in college when I thought my whole path was before me. And I just found it wondrous. He not only welcomed the questions, but he had so much to say about them. He could take the questions so much further. And that's how I ended up going into philosophy of science. So to me, this in some sense gets to the heart of what's the connection between these two. I mean, there does seem often to be a tension, but there ought not to be. There shouldn't be a tension. All philosophers should know what science is telling us. And science often presents philosophical questions like the most basic one. What is science telling us? Is it an instrument for prediction and nothing more? Or is it widening our knowledge of reality? Is it asking what philosophers would call ontological questions, questions about the nature of being? So, I had very much the intuition that, yeah, that's the beauty of physics, to correct our folk physics about reality. For example, that simultaneity is absolute. No, it's not. We learned that from relativity theory, or that space and time are totally separate from each other. No, time and space are enmeshed in one another in the four-dimensional manifold, so that science is correcting our view. And that seems to me amazing that we evolved apes can do that, get past our observation. And I believe we can do that. But to argue for that view of science, you can't use science. There's the scientific method doesn't answer that. We're on philosophical ground, and you can, like my old professor, say, oh, that's meaningless. If it's not scientific, it's meaningless. That itself is an incredibly philosophical statement. It has to do with how propositions acquire meaning. Do they only acquire meaning if they can be answered empirically? A philosophical view known as positivism. But you have to argue for these propositions. So science is always casting up philosophical questions. Philosophers have to know the science. They can't violate what the science is telling us, but they can address themselves, and they're trained to address themselves to one scene when we have a philosophical question, not a scientific question, and how you might go about arguing for your position one way or the other, to realize the other positions that are possible, all of that stuff. There is a tension often. Scientists often feel as if philosophers are trying to take over what science is doing, and no, it's a symbiotic relationship, or in any case, it ought to be a symbiotic relationship. So I have no patience for philosophers who are ignorant of science. I have no patience for scientists who are ignorant of where science stops and philosophical questions intrude.
You argue that philosophy is not just a subject for academic study, but has practical applications in fields such as education, politics, and technology. Could you give some examples of how philosophy can be useful in these areas and why it's so important to bring philosophical thinking into these contexts?
Philosophy is divided into different branches, and one of the most fundamental branches is what we call epistemology. Very, very fundamental questions in philosophy that have to do with the nature of knowledge, what it is, what's required for us to really know something, as opposed to merely believe it. And the truth is not enough. You have to have good reasons to justify your beliefs. What counts as justification? Are there limits to what we can know? Given our cognitive equipment, are there questions that we can ask that might have answers? Sometimes they don't have answers, but are we equipped, to be able to answer these sorts of questions? I think so many of the deepest political divides in us, the kinds that are causing immense trouble all over the globe, polarization, etc., have to do with these questions that if we would first ask, look, what's required to really know the answer to this question? Like, what are we here for? Is there any reason why we're here? Is there some purpose to human life, or are we all supposed to find our purpose? Just like cosmos itself have some answer for us about why we're supposed to be here. These kinds of questions, they spark the deepest controversies, between religious people and agnostic or atheist freethinkers, and they have at heart to do with epistemology. What can we know and what can't we know? And it would be good for people in general, starting really, really young, because children are naturally philosophical. They really are. Their scheme of things is still in flux. They're trying to get a sense of how things hang together, what kind of world they found themselves in. They're really trying to figure all that out. If we started really young talking about questions of, how do we justify our beliefs? What count as good reasons? What count as bad reasons? What's the difference between reasons that everybody can kind of accept or maybe argue about and just bare emotions? This is the way I want the world to be, therefore it is that way. The fallacy of that kind of thinking. That would be really useful. I have 2 daughters, and now I even have 2 grandsons. One is too young. He's just beginning to talk, but one is 6. We have the most amazing philosophical conversations, as I did, when my daughters were young. They're so open. They're so willing to ask the best questions. And kids are so open to this. What can we know? What can't we know? What are good reasons? For example, my little grandson, so we have a place in the summer near the ocean, and it's much cooler there. He was then, I think, 4. He was trying to figure out why it's cooler there at the ocean. And he came up with not a bad theory about the salt. Salt is a metal, and if you touch a spoon, if you touch something that's metal, it feels colder. So it must be the salt in the ocean that's cooling off the air, and that's why it's cooler. And I thought that was a really good attempt at an explanation. And I said to him, that's a really good attempt. Would you like to hear the correct explanation? And he just sort of looked at me and said, no, I want to figure it out for myself. And I just thought, wow, that's sort of like, it's really great. He's got the sense of what an explanation is. He'll accept that something can seem to make sense, but it's not the correct explanation. There's so much to be done at that stage of development that would carry through. What we call epistemic modesty, epistemic humility, would do the world a world of good. There's so much epistemic arrogance, and that's not good. That's not good. We should feel really proud of ourselves, that evolved apes that we are. We've come as far as we have. I think it's incredible. Again, that we're able to correct our physics with these sophisticated mathematical theories. And we should take some pride in that, but not think our knowledge is limitless. So anyway, I just think that attitude of epistemic modesty would have practical applications.